3 men in a white cargo van waited in a hospital employee lot in Pilsen, Chicago at 10 past noon on a bright Tuesday in February. Engine running, plates crusted over with road salt. Broad daylight, 40 cars in the lot. A crossing guard 2 blocks up. That's what nobody understands about men like them. They don't hide. Hiding is for people who think somebody's counting. They weren't there for money. Nobody ever asked for money. They were there for a woman who weighed 112 pounds, 30 weeks along, walking out of a 12-hour night shift into sunlight she hadn't seen in 3 days, with her keys already between her fingers the way every woman in that city learns to hold them. Her name was Renata Vukovic, 27 years old, an emergency room nurse at St. Adalbert Community Hospital. And by then she'd already buried her mother, her father, her younger brother, and a husband the state had written off as a single-vehicle accident on Interstate 55. She had a plastic lunch container in one hand and a bus pass in the other, and nothing else in this world except the child she was carrying and a name she'd already picked out for him. When they took her, she didn't scream, and she didn't beg. She said one thing, in the flat, steady voice of a woman who'd spent 8 years telling strangers to breathe while they were dying. She said, "Tie my hands. Just my hands, that was all." It took 11 seconds. 2 people watched it happen from the sidewalk and told themselves it was probably a family thing. And the 3 men in that van never once looked at the black Mercedes parked 40 meters back, sun on the windshield, engine still warm, because men like them never look at the expensive cars. They assume the expensive cars belong to doctors. The man behind the wheel was 34 years old. His name was Augustin Kovac. Gray cashmere sweater, charcoal wool coat, no jewelry except his mother's wedding ring on a silver chain under his shirt. And in that city, there were roughly 200 men who wouldn't say his name out loud in a room with the windows open. He wasn't a good man. He'd broken hands. He'd burned trucks. He'd sat in quiet rooms where the fate of absent people got decided with a nod. And 3 weeks earlier, at 3 in the morning, in the worst lit break room in Chicago, this woman had handed him a cup of terrible coffee and asked him if he'd eaten yet. She hadn't known who he was. She hadn't cared. She'd pushed his money back across the counter and told him she'd saved the boy's hand for the boy, not for him. In 14 years, nobody had ever asked Augustin Kovac if he'd eaten. He didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone. He sat in that car in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon and counted his own breathing until the van's taillights turned south toward the state line. And then he opened the door, stepped out into the slush, and picked up her lunch container off the ground where they'd let it fall. Here's what nobody in that van understood. They thought they'd grabbed a witness. They thought they had leverage. What they'd actually done was collect a debt from a man who pays them. And there's a very specific difference between a criminal and a man with a rule, and it's the kind of difference you only learn once. He didn't come with an army. He came with a phone, a forearm he hadn't broken yet, and a list of 9 names he was still 3 days away from writing down. And by the end of it, he'd hand over everything he owned to a federal agent who'd spent 6 years trying to put him in prison, and he'd do it on purpose, and he'd walk into that courtroom on his own 2 feet. Because somewhere in a cold storage room in Hammond, Indiana, a nurse was refusing to talk, and it wasn't courage. It was something much worse than courage. If this one gets to you the way it got to us, hit that like button and let us know you're out there. Share it with the person you haven't checked on in a while. And subscribe, because we've got more of these coming. Now, let's go back to that parking lot in Pilsen, to a Tuesday afternoon in February, and to a woman who asked a stranger a simple question 3 weeks before her whole world came apart. 4 months before that Tuesday afternoon, on an October evening, when Chicago still wasn't cold enough for people to close their windows, Casey Ardeline stood in the kitchen doorway of their second-floor apartment on 19th Street, and neither stepped in nor stepped out. He stood exactly on the line where the living room's hardwood floor gave way to the kitchen tile, 1 foot on one side and the other on the other. His coat draped over his arm as though he still intended to go somewhere, a file folder tucked beneath his arm, as thick as an old telephone directory. Renata was washing dishes. She heard him come home, heard his keys drop into the ceramic dish by the entrance, and then heard nothing, and that nothing lasted longer than it usually did. She stood there with her hands still submerged in soapsuds and thought, in a vague and distant way, that her husband was breathing through his mouth. And people only breathed through their mouths. when they had been running, or when they were afraid. He didn't say anything for a long while. Then he spoke, and his voice sounded like the voice of a man asking for directions in a city he knew well. "Should I submit it, or should we just stay quiet?" She didn't turn around. Later, she would think about that more than anything else in her life. Not the answer. The fact that she didn't turn around. She could have turned. She could have dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle, crossed the 4 steps through that tiny kitchen, and looked into his face. And if she had, perhaps she would have seen what she would only understand much later. But she was tired. She had just finished her shift. The hot water was running, and the plate in her hand had a hardened streak of tomato sauce around the rim that she was trying to scrape away with her fingernail. So she only said, in the voice of someone answering a question she believed was easy, "Submit it." "You know that." Behind her, Casey Ardeline nodded. She didn't see that nod. She only heard the file folder being set down on the dining table, a soft, certain thud, and she thought that was the end of it, and she went on scraping at the tomato sauce. He didn't say, "All right." He didn't say, "Yeah." He didn't say anything else that entire evening, except that he would get up early, and whether they needed milk, and that it looked as though it might rain. He was a safety engineer. His entire professional life had been spent standing in front of machines and calculating where they would fail, and he was good at it. And inside that home he did the same thing. He saw the breaking point before anything broke. He simply never said it aloud. Renata finished washing the dishes, took a shower, and went to sleep. She slept well. That was the detail she would never be able to forgive herself for. A few days later, a state trooper called her near dawn, and his voice carried a rhythm Renata recognized at once, because she had used that same rhythm with other people for 8 years. Slow down by a quarter, drop the voice by half an octave, and never use a word that could mean 2 things. He said Interstate 55. He said loss of control. He said no other vehicles were involved. He said she could come down to make the identification whenever she was ready. And Renata heard herself answer that she would come down right now. And she heard how calm her voice was, so steady that the man on the other end paused for a beat, because he wasn't used to that. They handed her a watch inside a zippered plastic bag. The crystal was cracked diagonally from the 4 o'clock position to the 10 o'clock position. The leather strap was worn at the 3rd hole, the one he always used, because his wrist was smaller than most men's, and he often joked that this was why he never beat anyone at arm wrestling. She lifted the plastic bag, looked through the plastic, and said, "Yes, it's his," and someone wrote it down on a form, and that was the end of it. She didn't ask anything else. People thought she was in shock. In truth, she was calculating, because that was the only thing her mind knew how to do when something happened. She was thinking that it hadn't rained that day, that the road had been dry, that there had been no fog and no ice, and that Casey Ardeline was the kind of man who had once made her sit in the car for another 10 minutes in a supermarket parking lot, because he wanted to check the tire pressure again with the pocket gauge he carried. She didn't say that to anyone, not because she was afraid, because she looked around that small room that smelled of paper and cold coffee, and she understood, with perfect clarity, that no one in that room was the person to whom such a sentence should be spoken. From that day on, Renata Vukovic took every night shift. She told Human Resources it was more convenient. The truth was much simpler. At night, the hospital was full of people, but no one had time. No one looked into anyone else's face for longer than 3 seconds. And for those 12 hours, there wouldn't be a single person who asked her whether she was all right. 3 weeks before that Tuesday afternoon, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the doors of the emergency department at St. Adalbert Community Hospital burst open, and 4 men walked in, and not one of them was willing to sit down. That was the first thing Renata Vukovic noticed, even before the hand. When people came into an emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, they sat. They sat because they were tired, because they were afraid, because they knew they would have to wait. These 4 men remained standing, and they stood in a formation she had seen before in other places. 1 man by the door, 1 in the hallway, 1 against the wall, and 1 in the middle. The man in the middle was the tallest. At the center of that formation, sitting in the only plastic chair anyone had taken, was a 19-year-old boy named Kiro, his face drained white, clutching a hand wrapped inside another man's coat. The coat was expensive. That was the second detail she noticed. No one wrapped a hand in a coat that expensive unless it had been the closest thing within reach and its owner hadn't had time to think. She walked over, pulled the curtain closed, and as she bent down, she saw it, the thing protruding beneath the tallest man's gray sweater when he leaned forward, and she looked at it for exactly a fraction of a second before looking away. She didn't ask anything. She didn't ask for his real name, didn't ask about insurance, didn't ask what had happened. She was the night shift emergency room nurse in Pilsen, and she had been doing this for 8 years without missing a single shift. And in those 8 years she had learned that there were certain questions which, once asked, would make people carry one another out the door, and the boy would lose his hand. What she said was the last thing anyone in that room expected. She straightened. Elle looked at the tallest man, and spoke with the clinical authority she reserved for those who were drunk, frightened, or about to do something foolish. "Take off your coat, sit down. You're scaring him more than his hand is." There were 4 men in that room whose very presence could silence a crowded street. 3 of them stood frozen, their breath catching in their throats at her audacity, and the 4th, the tallest one, the man in the middle, looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, then removed his overcoat, folded it, and sat down. She worked for 35 minutes. She kept it clean, quiet, and fast, speaking to Kiro the entire time in a steady voice, about things that had nothing to do with any of it, about the weather, about the baseball team, about how everyone seemed to be catching the flu that season, and the boy held on to that voice as though it were a rope. When she was finished, she sat down at the computer and entered a name that wasn't his, a birth date that wasn't his, and an address in a neighborhood no one would check. The tallest man watched her type. He didn't say anything until she clicked save. Then he asked why. She didn't turn away from the screen. "Not because of you," she said. "Because he still has his whole life ahead of him to apply for jobs." He pulled out a stack of money and placed it on the counter, and the way he set it down showed that he had performed that gesture many times in his life, and no one had ever refused him. Renata looked at the stack of money, then pushed it back toward him with 2 fingers, exactly the way someone would slide a tray of contaminated instruments out of a sterile field, and turned back to the screen. He left it there for another moment before picking it up, and for those brief 2 seconds, Augustine Kovac looked like a man who had spoken the wrong language in a foreign country. She stood, walked to the coffee pot in the corner of the nurse's station, the one that had been plugged in since midnight and had tasted burned for the past 3 hours, poured a cup, and set it down in front of him. Then she asked him a question. "Have you eaten anything?" He couldn't answer. She opened her blue plastic lunch container, took out the half sandwich left from the beginning of her shift, broke it in 2, handed him 1/2, and sat down in the chair beside him. They ate in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere beyond the hallway, someone was pushing a cart with a broken wheel, and Augustin Kovac sat in the darkest nurse's station in Chicago, eating half a sandwich given to him by a woman who didn't know who he was and wanted nothing from him, while drinking the worst coffee he had ever tasted in his life. Then she stood to leave, and he saw her belly. She had kept it hidden while she sat, not deliberately, but simply because that was how people sat when their backs hurt. Now she was standing, and it was there, and he looked at it longer than politeness allowed, and something very old inside him stirred and rolled onto its other side. His mother. The concrete floor of a cold storage warehouse on Halsted Street. A stranger carrying her out. He didn't say anything about it. He had never spoken of it to anyone. When the 4 of them reached the parking lot, the sky was still dark, and snow was falling in fine, powdery flakes. Augustin stood beside the car for a moment, looking back at the emergency room's glass doors glowing yellow. Then he spoke to the man nearest him, his voice quiet, almost casual. "She walks home." 4 o'clock in the morning, the other man waited. "Take her all the way to her door," Augustin said. "Don't let her know." 30 minutes after the van turned south, the 2nd floor of the warehouse on Halsted Street was lit, and Benedict Hadju stood in the middle of the room with his bifocals pushed up onto his forehead. He didn't shout, because in 30 years he had never shouted, but his voice carried the cadence that only one person in the world was permitted to use with Augustine Kovac. "She isn't one of ours, Augie. She isn't registered. She hasn't taken a single cent from us. She's a night shift nurse in Pilsen, and she doesn't owe you anything." Augustin stood at the window with his back turned, looking down at the parking lot where the snow was melting into the gray slush this city called winter. He let the words remain there for a long while. Then he spoke without turning around. "You're right. I'm the one who owes her." Benny opened his mouth, then closed it, and he did what he had done thousands of times over 30 years. He picked up his pen and began to write. By morning, they had 3 things. They had the direction the van had taken. They had the route a cargo van would have to follow if it wanted to leave Cook County without passing a way station. And they had a name, and that name was Ferric Doyle. The Polish Tavern in Avondale opened at 10 o'clock in the morning for people who needed a drink at 10 o'clock in the morning. Plywood floors, a neon sign for a beer company that had gone bankrupt, and the smell every place like that carried, yesterday's spilled beer soaked into the wood from the day before. Augustin walked in alone. The bartender didn't look up. In Avondale, everyone looked up when he entered. He walked past, sat down at the corner table across from Ferric Doyle, and ordered a cup of tea. Ferric laughed. Ferric Doyle was the kind of man who earned his living by knowing the small things other people needed, and that profession had taught him that the only thing in the world that mattered was timing. And he believed this moment belonged to him. He named a number. Then he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands over his stomach, and waited for the bargaining to begin. Augustin didn't bargain. He waited for the bartender to set down the tea, thanked him, then wrapped both hands around the cup like a man trying to warm himself and spoke in a quiet voice that made people tilt their heads to hear. "You've owed the Cordero family since spring." Ferric didn't move. "I bought that debt last week, and then nothing happened." That was what made it frightening. No one stood, no one touched anyone. Nothing was said about consequences, and no promise was made about anything at all. Augustin Kovac simply sat there with both hands around the hot cup of tea, looking at Ferric Doyle with pale amber eyes. People said resembled a light burning in a warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he remained silent for 9 seconds. 9 seconds in a room with 4 people and a running refrigerator was a very long time. You could hear the refrigerator. You could hear the traffic outside. And if you were Ferric Doyle, you could hear the blood beating inside your own ears. At the 9th second, Ferric reached for the stack of napkins on the table, pulled one free, and began to write. His number 7 looked like a number 1 because his hand was trembling. He pushed the napkin across the table. Augustin read it, folded it, and slipped it into his inside pocket. Then he took out an envelope and placed it on the table. Enough. Exactly the number Ferric had named, not a dollar missing. Ferric stared at the envelope as though it were an animal whose name he didn't know. You're still paying me?" Of course. Augustin took out another sheet of paper, folded it into quarters, and slid it across. Ferric opened it, read it, and needed a moment to understand what he was holding. The debt from spring, cleared, signed, stamped, no conditions. "I'm not robbing you," Augustin said. He took a sip of tea. "I'm only showing you the price of bargaining with me, and the price of being honest with me. You chose the second. 9 seconds late, but you still chose it." He stood, left money for the tea on the table, and walked out. Ferric Doyle remained there with an envelope full of money and a document, clearing his debt. And he didn't touch either one for 20 minutes, because he had just understood something that wiser men than him spent their whole lives trying to understand, that the man who had just walked out the door had never needed to hurt anyone, and that was exactly why Ferric was too afraid to stand. Outside, Augustin unfolded the napkin beneath the daylight, read the crooked string of numbers again, and called Benny. "We have the plate." There was a beat of silence on the other end. "You still have time to stop, Augie." "No," Augustin said. "I stopped having time the night she asked whether I'd eaten." The license plate led to a rest stop on Interstate 90, the kind of place people only stopped when their bladders forced them to. And they found Odell Price in the men's restroom, between the last stall and the wall, where he had crawled until he couldn't crawl any farther. He was 24 years old. They had left him there because he had dared to say no. Augustin didn't ask anything for the first 2 minutes. He removed his scarf, soaked it in cold water, and wiped the young man's face. He tilted a bottle so that one sip of water ran into his mouth, waited, then tilted it again for another. Then he called him by name, not, "Hey, not you there," his name. That was what made Odell Price open his eyes. "You aren't a cop," he said. "No? Then who are you?" Augustin crouched on the filthy tile floor in the gray cashmere sweater he would never wear again. and spoke in the quiet voice that made people lean closer to hear. "The man who's going to tell your mother that you tried to stop them," Odell Price cried. Then Odell Price talked, and what he said brought down the entire structure Augustine Kovac had built inside his mind over the past 24 hours. No one wanted money. There had never been any plan to make a ransom call. There had been no plan at all except one, and it wasn't kidnapping, it was cleanup. Northline Logistics operated the largest cold chain in the Midwest, and inside the refrigerated containers traveling the corridor from Chicago down to Gary, and then back up toward Milwaukee, they carried more than beef and ice cream. They carried insulin. They carried antibiotics. They carried temperature-controlled crates, bound for free clinics in Pilsen, in Cicero, in back of the yards, places where people lined up at 6 o'clock in the morning and sat in plastic chairs for half the day to see a doctor for 9 minutes. The temperature sensors in 43 containers had failed, not all at once. Gradually, continuously, beginning sometime during a summer, no one had bothered to record. Repairing them would have cost an amount of money that someone on the 44th floor had calculated was too great. So instead of repairing the sensors, they repaired the logs. Every night a spreadsheet was completed, filled with beautiful, steady numbers resting neatly within the permitted range, then signed, saved, and sent. And inside those containers, insulin warmed, then cooled again, then warmed once more, and when something like that happened, it didn't change color, didn't change smell, didn't develop a film, didn't do anything at all to warn anyone. It simply stopped working. People still injected it. Doctors looked into their eyes and told them the medicine was good. And the doctors believed what they were saying because the temperature logs were right there. Stamped, signed, perfect. Then those people went home, injected themselves, and wondered why they were still thirsty, why they were still tired, why the wounds on their feet wouldn't heal. 9 people had died in half a year. All of them were adults. Most were elderly. Every one of them had gone to clinics where people had to line up at 6 o'clock in the morning. An 81-year-old man in Cicero. An old woman who sold flowers at Maxwell Market. A house painter. A dishwasher. 9 names scattered through 9 different ledgers in 9 different places, and no one connected them. No one sent samples for testing. No one opened an investigation. And the reason was so simple it was cruel. No one was counting them. And Casey Ardelian, the safety engineer, had connected them. By then, Odell had begun to drift. His voice grew softer and more broken, and Augustine had to bend close to hear him. "She isn't a hostage," Odell whispered. "Never was. She's the last piece," Mrs. Arnault said. Said once they found the copy, they wouldn't need her anymore. Then almost to himself, almost asleep, he murmured, "There was another name. Ardelian. An engineer." Mrs. Arnault said he didn't submit it, he only printed it out. She said it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. Augustine didn't react. He didn't ask him to repeat it. He didn't blink. He only raised the bottle of water again. Odell opened his eyes one last time. Will you tell my mother? She's in Cicero." "Her name is Dorothy. I'll go today," Augustine said. And he did that very afternoon before he did anything else. And it was the only thing during those 14 hours that he didn't tell anyone about. 9 o'clock that night, in the warehouse on Halsted Street, Benedict Hadju had spread the files across the long table like a man laying out a hand of cards he already knew he would lose. He didn't look at Augustine when he spoke. He looked at the paper in front of him, and he used the voice of a tax accountant, reading out a number his client wouldn't like. "You told me you had someone follow her because you were worried about her." Augustine stood at the window. "You told me she walked home at 4 o'clock in the morning and that you didn't feel right about it." No one said anything. The electrical cabinet in the corner hummed. Augie. "She knows your face." Only then did Benny look up, sliding his bifocals down the bridge of his nose so he could see clearly, because he wanted to see clearly. "She saw what was under your sweater. She entered a false name into the hospital system for one of your men. She sat beside you for 30 minutes, and she remembers your face. She's a witness, Augie, and you did exactly what you've done with every witness for the past 14 years. You put eyes on her." Augustine didn't turn around. Outside below them, a truck was backing into the loading bay, its reverse lights flashing, the steady beep of its warning alarm carrying across the empty concrete yard. "I don't remember what I was thinking," he said. "You remember." And that was the worst part, because Benny Hadju was the only person in the world permitted to say those words. And also the only person in the world who had been there long enough to know they were true. Augustine Kovac stood in the warehouse's murky yellow light and tried to remember the moment in the hospital parking lot, near 4 o'clock in the morning, the moment when he had opened his mouth and said, "Take her all the way to her door, don't let her know." And he searched within it for the thing he had always believed was there, and he couldn't find it. He remembered the snow, he remembered the yellow light shining through the glass doors. He remembered the taste of burned coffee still clinging to his mouth, and he remembered, as clearly though someone had switched on, a light in a room he had never dared enter. That the first instinct to pass through his mind when he saw her rise from that plastic chair hadn't been that she was pregnant, but that she had seen him. The two thoughts had come at the same time. He hadn't been able to separate them then, and now, 24 hours after a white van had carried that woman south, he still couldn't separate them. Perhaps he had someone follow her because of the snow. Perhaps he had someone follow her because of her belly. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had done exactly what a man like him had done for 14 years whenever someone saw his face. He had put eyes on them, and he had called it kindness because this time it didn't hurt. "Uncle Benny, yes, if you're right, then I didn't come here to repay a debt." Benny removed his glasses, wiped them with the tail of his shirt, and put them back on. "No," he said, "but you're still here." Then he pulled 3 pages from the pile of files, stacked them one on top of another, and told him in 3 sentences, because 3 sentences were enough. She had sent it to the State Department of Health in November, and the file had been recorded as lost during transfer. She had sent it to a federal inspector named Gilroy in December, and Gilroy had a bank account whose balance didn't match his salary. She had sent it to a newsroom in January, and the newsroom survived on advertising pages bearing the name Northline. "She isn't hiding because she's afraid, Augie." Benny tapped one finger against the 3 pages. "She's hiding because she tried 3 times, and every time she sent it away, it disappeared. It wasn't blocked. No one blocked it. No door slammed shut in her face. It simply vanished as though it had never existed, as though those 9 people had never existed." Augustine looked at the 3 pages for a long time. His entire life had been built on a single logic, and it was simple. There was always someone behind everything, and once you found that person, you found the lever. He had found Ferric Doyle in half a day. He had found Odell Price in 1 day. But the thing that had swallowed Renata Vukovic's 3 reports had no face, no name, and didn't sit at a corner table in some tavern in Avondale waiting for him to come and face it. It wasn't afraid of him. It didn't even know he existed. He had spent 14 years becoming the man, whose name no one dared speak in a room with an open window. And that night, for the first time, he understood that he was standing before something with no face for him to strike. Warehouse number 7 in Hammond, Indiana, was a building that had officially ceased operations nearly a year earlier, and still paid its electric bill faithfully every month. And at its center was a holding room kept at roughly 36 degrees, the temperature people used for flowers and vegetables, and things that mustn't freeze but mustn't grow warm either. Inside that holding room, every breath became smoke. Renata Vukovic sat on a blue plastic chair in the middle of the concrete floor, her hands tied, only her hands exactly as she had demanded, and she stared directly at the door. The door had a small square window at eye level. Beyond that window, on the corridor wall, there was an iron hook, and hanging from that hook was her coat. Desmond Rainwater had hung it there. He had stepped into the corridor, placed it on the hook, adjusted it until it hung neatly, then returned and sat on a forklift across from her, and he hadn't said a single word about it. That was the whole point. He didn't need to say anything. The coat remained there, exactly 10 feet and 1 door away from her, the old blue puffer coat she had worn through 4 winters, the one with a zipper broken in the middle, so that she always had to pull it up from the bottom with both hands, and every time she looked through the square window, it was still there, silent, orderly, belonging to her, and no longer belonging to her. Desmond Rainwater's cruelty wasn't in the temperature. It was in the hook. She didn't beg. That was what had irritated him from the first hour, and what irritated him more with every hour that passed. He had done this many times. He knew the order of it. First came anger, then bargaining, then tears, then words. This woman moved through none of those stages. She sat upright, both feet parallel on the concrete floor, and spoke softly. He had to tilt his head to hear her, and when he did, he couldn't understand, because it wasn't English. It was the language her mother had once sung to her in a kitchen in Pilsen many winters ago. The language she had believed she had forgotten and discovered she hadn't. And Desmond Rainwater sat on his forklift and thought the woman was praying, and that reassured him a little, because people prayed when they were about to break. She wasn't praying. She was explaining. She was speaking to her child very slowly, very clearly, the way someone spoke to a person far away over a failing connection, telling the baby that she was sorry for this place, that she wouldn't tell them, and that the child had to understand why. Because one October evening, a man had stood in the kitchen doorway of their home, one foot on one side and one on the other, his coat draped over his arm, and he had asked her a question, and she hadn't turned around to look at him. He had died because of that file. If she spoke now, his death would no longer mean anything. It would become nothing more than an accident on the interstate, a watch inside a plastic bag, a name written on a form, and he would die a second time, and this time he would die for nothing at all. So I won't tell them, my child. I'll keep it. It's the only thing I still have left to keep. Across the room, Desmond Rainwater took out his phone, looked at the screen, and put it away. He had repeated that gesture many times over the past 2 hours. He scratched his left wrist. He stood, took 3 steps, and sat down again. And Renata Vukovic, an emergency room night nurse for 8 years, a woman who had stood beside thousands of people in the moment when their bodies revealed the truth, before their mouths had time to speak it, stopped speaking Croatian and began speaking in English, using the flat, professional voice she used when telling people to breathe. Your breathing is too fast, he spun toward her. You're breathing about 22 times a minute. A person sitting still normally breathes 16. You aren't cold. You're wearing a coat. You're worried. He opened his mouth, then closed it. You've checked your phone 4 times in the past half hour. You're waiting for a call. She looked at him calmly, as though she were reading a chart. And it hasn't come. Inside the holding room at warehouse number 7, Desmond Rainwater stood and walked out into the corridor. And as he passed the door, he didn't look at the coat hanging from the hook, because he didn't need to look at it, because it wasn't there for him to see. The door closed. Renata turned back toward the square window, and she began speaking softly again in the language her mother had once sung. The Kovac family had unloaded cargo at warehouse number 7 for 9 years, and that was the one thing Desmond Rainwater had never taken into account when he chose it. Augustin didn't need blueprints. He knew where the main breaker was because he had once stood waiting beside it on summer mornings when the compressors overloaded. He knew the rolling door at loading bay 4 jammed near the end and had to be lifted with a shoulder. And he knew the safety release valve on the pipe running along the machine room ceiling hung exactly within reach of a man as tall as he was. At 2:15 in the morning, he cut the breaker. The entire building went dark in half a heartbeat, and then the temperature alarm began to howl, that long, steady, mindless wail every cold storage warehouse in the world seemed to have, a sound designed to make people run rather than think. He turned the valve. White vapor spilled across the floor like water, thick and low, crawling over the concrete and rising to waist height in the time it took someone to count to 10. It wasn't enough to harm anyone. It was only enough to make it impossible for anyone to keep their eyes open. Outside, his men pulled down the rolling doors and locked them from the other side, all 4 of them, and there was now no exit in that building. Augustin Kovac didn't know. He moved through the vapor as though wading through waist-deep water, not quickly, counting doors with his left hand pressed against the wall. He heard people running. He heard someone crash into a stack of pallets and fall. There were no gunshots. He didn't fire a single shot that entire night, and later, when people told the story in the kinds of places where stories like that were told, that was the detail no one believed. In the corridor outside the holding room, Desmond Rainwater stood against the wall, one hand covering his nose with the edge of his coat, the other gripping an iron bar as long as his arm, and he laughed when he heard the footsteps. Kovac, the vapor had risen to his chest. Do you know how we found her? Augustin stopped. You think it was because she was stupid? Because she gave herself away? Desmond Rainwater coughed once, then kept laughing, and that laugh was something Augustin would hear again inside his own mind many times over the next 17 years. It had nothing to do with whether she was clever or stupid. The moment her little doctor friend flagged the system by querying those files, Mrs. Arnaud knew exactly who our target was. But she didn't need a detective to locate her, Mr. Kovac. She didn't need to follow anyone. He struck the iron bar against the concrete floor once. All she needed to know when and where to grab her was a duty roster. And Augustin Kovac stood chest deep in white vapor in the corridor of warehouse number 7 and understood the worst thing that night could have given him. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't an informant. It wasn't a mistake. The thing that had sold Renata Vukovic to these people was the very best thing about her. She had shown up. She showed up every night. She showed up when her mother died. She showed up when her father died. She showed up 3 days after someone handed her a watch inside a zippered plastic bag. She showed up because at night no one asked whether she was all right. And that devotion, the very thing that made her who she was, existed on a human resources server as an unbroken row of green boxes, and anyone who opened it knew exactly where she would be standing at 12:10 on Tuesday afternoon. No one needed to hunt her. She had been writing her own schedule on the wall for 8 years. Desmond Rainwater swung the iron bar. Augustin saw it coming. He could have stepped back. He didn't. He raised his left forearm and took the blow, and a dry crack sounded through the corridor, and the vapor swallowed its echo. Then he used his right hand. It didn't take long. When it was over, Desmond Rainwater lay on the wet concrete floor, and the iron bar had rolled somewhere into the vapor, and Augustin lowered himself onto one knee beside him, his left forearm hanging loose, and spoke quietly, almost gently, just loudly enough for a man at that distance to hear and no farther. "I'm not doing this because you're a bad man," Desmond wheezed. "I'm doing it because you hung her coat outside the door, because you thought of that. And because you did it without hesitating for even 1 second." He stood. He left Des lying there. Then he turned toward the door with the square window at the end of the corridor, the only door in the building he hadn't opened, and on the wall beside it, hanging from an iron hook, was an old blue puffer coat with a zipper broken in the middle. He took the blue puffer coat down from the iron hook before opening the door. He did it with one hand because the other no longer worked, and it took him longer than it should have, and he didn't hurry. Then he pushed the door open. Renata Vukovic sat on the blue plastic chair in the middle of the concrete floor, facing the square window, in exactly the same position she had held through all those hours, and when the door opened, she didn't startle. She only looked up. The man standing in the doorway was tall, his hair damp with sweat, one forearm hanging loose in a way an emergency room nurse could recognize with a single glance, and in his uninjured hand was her coat. He didn't say anything. He walked toward her and placed the puffer coat across her lap, then removed his own charcoal wool coat, the most expensive thing in that entire building, and wrapped it around her shoulders. He did that first. He did it before the restraints. She watched him and didn't understand why, and much later, when she told this story to the only person she ever told, that was always the detail she began with. Not the white vapor, not the door, but the order in which he had done things. Only then did he take out a knife and cut the bindings. He didn't cut quickly. He cut the way someone cut sutures, his fingers supporting the cord from beneath, the blade angled away from her skin. When he was finished, he didn't stand. He lowered himself onto one knee on the concrete floor in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers, and he spoke. "You saved the hand of one of my boys. You entered his records under another name. You didn't take my money." He paused. Somewhere behind him, the temperature alarm was still wailing. "I came to repay you." He said nothing more. He didn't tell her what Benedict Hajdu had placed on the long table in the dark warehouse the night before, the truth he was still carrying inside himself like a shard of glass buried in his palm, that he might have ordered someone to follow her, not because of the snow, but because she had seen his face. He didn't say it because he didn't know which reason was true. And he didn't say it because in that moment, kneeling on the wet concrete floor inside a room kept at roughly 36 degrees, he understood that confessing it would be a gift he gave himself, not her, and he had spent his entire life taking what he wanted from rooms like this one, so he remained silent. Renata looked at him for a long time. Her voice was raw from going unused for so many hours. "How long did it take you?" 14 hours. She nodded, only nodded, as though someone had just read her a test result, and she was still processing the number. And then Renata Vukovic, who hadn't screamed when they dragged her into the van in broad daylight, who hadn't begged through all those hours, who had sat with her back straight and spoken to her child in the language her mother once sang, and hadn't shed a single tear, began to cry. She didn't cry because she was afraid. She cried because in all 27 years of her life, this was the first time anyone had come. Her mother had died in a kitchen and no one came. Her father had died through the course of a long winter and no one came. She had sat in a room that smelled of paper and cold coffee, holding a watch inside a zippered plastic bag, and no one came. She had sent 3 reports into a vast mouth without a face, and no one came. She had gone to thousands of strangers over 8 years, gone every night, on time, without missing a single shift, and no one had ever come for her. 14 hours. This man didn't even know her last name. She cried for about a minute, and he didn't touch her, and he didn't say anything to soothe her, and that was right too. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, released a trembling breath, and did something she hadn't planned. She took his uninjured hand, that large, calloused, freezing hand, and drew it onto her belly. He went rigid as though electricity had passed through him. "Kick," she whispered, not to him. "Kick so he knows you're still here." There was a silence. Then, beneath Augustine Kovic's palm, a kick. Small, very certain. The man who could bring an entire labor union to a halt with one phone call. The shadow whose reputation had cast a long, terrifying pall over the city's underground for over a decade, sank down onto the wet concrete floor and couldn't say anything for a very long time. On the drive back to Chicago, inside a car that wasn't his, Augustine asked her where she had hidden it, and her answer made him turn to look at her. There was no hard drive, no cloud storage, no safe, no bank deposit box. There was a wooden chess set, the cheap kind sold at drugstores, and inside that set was a king whose base had been hollowed out, and inside that hollow space was a piece of paper folded into quarters. The chess set was in a cardboard box, beneath the bed of an old man in the palliative care ward at St. Adalbert Community Hospital. "No one searches the belongings of someone who's about to die," she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield, "because no one thinks they still own anything. But the palliative care ward had visiting hours, and visiting hours began at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was only a little after 4, so they needed somewhere to wait for daylight." Father Stjepan Novotny, 70 years old, opened the doors of the old St. Adalbert Church, with a key he still carried in his pocket even though the church had been locked for years. And he didn't ask a single question, and that was something Renata would think about for the rest of her life. The ceiling leaked. The pews were covered with tarps. The statue of St. Adalbert still stood there with a layer of dust across its shoulders like snow. Renata sat on the altar steps, wrapped in the charcoal wool coat of a man whose name she had learned only 2 hours earlier, and in that silence she began to speak. She spoke about the kitchen in Pilsen, where her mother had died on a mattress laid across the floor because she had no insurance. She spoke about her father, a shipyard welder who lost one hand, then lost his will, then died over the course of a long winter. About her younger brother she said only one sentence, her voice dropping into a hushed, hollow quietness that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken griefs. "I was the one who found him. I won't tell that story. Not to you, not to anyone. There are some warnings a person is only permitted to carry alone." Then she fell silent for a while, and she laughed, and that laugh was worse than tears. "Do you know what's funny? I've been an emergency room nurse for 8 years. I save strangers all the time. I haven't managed to save a single person in my own family." Augustine sat on the step below her, his left forearm resting across his thigh, and he waited until the words had settled completely. Then he told her what he had been holding back since the rest stop. Casey Ardeline never submitted that report. She turned toward him. He sat in the company parking lot for 40 minutes with the file on his lap. Then he drove home. There was nothing inside the church except the sound of water dripping from the leak. He died because Arnaud discovered that he had printed it. That was all. He printed it. Printers keep logs. Renata Vukovic sat there for a very long time. When she was finally able to speak, her voice sounded strange, nothing like her own. "So he was afraid." Augustine said nothing. "He was afraid, and they killed him anyway." She looked up at the leaking ceiling. "Do you understand? I told him to submit it. I didn't even turn around to look at him. And he couldn't bring himself to do it. And they killed him anyway. He died without getting to be a good man. He simply died." "No." She turned sharply toward him. "He printed it and brought it home," Augustine said. "What do you think he brought it home for?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He could have torn it up. He could have left it in his desk drawer. He could have thrown it into a trash can at a gas station on the way home, and no one would ever have known. He carried it through the door of his home, walked past you, and placed it on your dining table. He paused. For you to find. Renata gripped the edge of the stone step with both hands. He knew he wasn't brave enough. He had probably known that about himself for a long time, maybe even before he married you. So he did the only thing a frightened man could do. He left it where a brave person would find it. Water dripped, one drop, then another. How long have you known? She asked. Since the rest stop. Since yesterday. Since yesterday. Why didn't you tell me? Augustin looked down at his hands. Because you were walking through the snow. Because you were carrying an entire building on your shoulders, and you didn't know you were carrying it. I meant to wait until you sat down. She looked around the closed church, at the stone step beneath her, at the expensive coat around her shoulders. I'm sitting down now, and from that moment forward, whenever Renata Vukovic thought of those 9 names, she counted 10. At 6 o'clock in the morning, an old radio in Father Novotny's sacristy caught the first news bulletin of the day, and Felicity Arnault won that round without ever leaving her desk. There was no pursuit, no gunmen were sent. She simply did what a vice president of risk management knew how to do better than anything else in the world. She called the police. The announcer's voice read the report clearly, slowly, and with careful concern. A pregnant nurse from St. Adalbert Community Hospital had been reported missing since Tuesday afternoon. Security cameras had recorded the victim being forced into a vehicle. Police were searching for a suspect connected to the Kovac organization, and the public was advised not to approach him. Then they read his name. Renata sat on the altar step and listened as that voice transformed the man who had knelt on the concrete floor before her into something the entire city would be hunting before lunch. She understood immediately, because she was a nurse, and nurses understood very quickly how a wrong diagnosis could kill someone faster than the illness itself. If the police found them first, she would be rescued. They would place her in an ambulance with a blanket around her shoulders and flashing lights overhead, and the chess king would go into an evidence bag, and everything would end very politely, very properly, and very quietly. Augustin was already on his feet before the bulletin ended. He spoke to Father Novotny in 3 quiet sentences, and the old man nodded and began walking toward the door that led down into the crypt, moving with the unhurried gait of a 70-year-old man who had never run in his life. His pursuers were 90 seconds too late. 90 seconds. If Felicity Arnault had left her office 1 traffic light earlier, she would have had everything. If the old man had taken 3 slower steps, he wouldn't have reached the door in time. Years later, Augustin Kovac would lie in a very small room and calculate those 90 seconds over and over again, more often than any other number in his life. They didn't break down the door. They entered through the front, 6 men in dark windbreakers walking in a line, and they didn't say a word. Father Stepan Novotny stood in the doorway leading to the crypt and ushered everyone through, and he did what he had done for 40 years in that parish, the only thing he knew how to do. He remained behind until everyone else was gone. He never walked again after that morning. That is all that needs to be said about it. He lived. 2 years later, he would sit in the courtroom in a wheelchair and smile at Renata across 3 rows of seats, and he would never, not once for the rest of his life, mention that morning to anyone. That was the price of opening the door to 2 strangers at 4 o'clock in the morning, without asking a single question. 2 of Augustin's men remained on the church's stone floor. He knew both of their wives' names. He would go to see them later, if there was a later. The black Mercedes in the courtyard had its windows shattered, its tires destroyed, and the most useless part of it ruined as well. The belief that men like him always had an escape waiting on 4 wheels. In the crypt, beneath the cold stone, Renata held on to his uninjured arm as they moved through the darkness along an escape passage only an old man who would never walk again knew still existed. They emerged into a drainage ditch behind the church, among dry bushes, while the sky was still dark. No car, no weapon. His left forearm was useless. His phone had been turned off since midnight because Benny had told him to shut it down. The nearest ally was miles away, on the other side of a city that would have his face on every screen by noon. Renata released a white breath into the cold and spoke for the first time since the bulletin had read his name. How did they know we were here? Augustin didn't answer at once. He looked back toward the church, its leaning bell tower, silhouetted against a sky that hadn't yet begun to brighten, and inside his mind, he went over the short list of people who knew, slowly, one step at a time. Benny didn't know. Benny only knew they had left Hammond. His men at warehouse number 7 didn't know. Father Novotny hadn't called anyone. He didn't even own a phone. There was only one person in the world who knew where the car that wasn't his had stopped at 4 o'clock that morning, and that person had driven it there. He paid for 2 bus tickets with the most valuable thing he still carried, and no one at the station that day knew it. Near 7 o'clock in the morning, inside an all-night grocery store on Ashland Avenue, Augustin Kovac stood in a checkout line for the first time in 14 years. He placed a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and 2 bananas on the counter, then counted out loose change with one hand. The old woman behind the register must have been 70, her hair tucked beneath a net and her glasses resting low on her nose. She scanned each item without looking at him, and when she reached the end, she reached beneath the counter, took out a cup of yogurt, dropped it into the bag, and didn't ring it up. He looked down. The old woman shrugged and nodded toward the glass door, where Renata was waiting on the sidewalk in the oversized charcoal wool coat. "Pareil el bébé," she said, then turned to the next customer. He remained there for another moment with the bag in his hand. He had spent his entire career believing that the world ran on leverage and fear, that everyone wanted something, and his only task was to discover what it was and hold it up before them. And an old woman had just given a cup of yogurt to a stranger for nothing, and she hadn't even waited to be thanked. They sat at the elevated train station on a stone bench beneath a metal roof, during that hour when the city still hadn't decided whether it wanted to wake. He told her about his mother, Ivanka Kovac, 19 years old, a night shift cleaner at a cold storage warehouse on Halsted Street. She was carrying him and hadn't told anyone, and the supervisor forced her to work a double shift because she didn't dare refuse. And one night she collapsed on the concrete floor between 2 rows of shelves and couldn't get back up. Someone walked past, he said. He carried her outside, put her in his car, drove her to the hospital, left her there, and went away. She didn't have time to ask his name. She spoke about him every Christmas for 30 years. Renata looked down at the tracks. "Why didn't you try to find him?" "Because I was afraid he was only an ordinary man passing by." He said the words very slowly. "If he was somebody, someone special, someone good, then I could live my whole life without having to think about anything. But if he was only an ordinary man passing by, then it meant anyone could have been that man, even me, and that would mean the past 14 years were my fault." She said nothing. Then she lowered herself slightly on the stone bench, and she didn't stand again. "I'm not going any farther." He turned toward her. She wasn't crying. That was what made it frightening. She spoke in the voice of someone reading another person's test results aloud. "I've been tired since I was 11 years old. I bathed my mother. I dragged my father out of bars. I identified my husband by a watch. I worked nights for 8 years so I wouldn't have to lie awake in the dark. I don't have a home. I don't have a job, and after this morning's news bulletin, I certainly won't. I don't have anyone." She stared straight ahead at the tracks. "Just take it. Take the chess piece and give it to whoever you want. You can do that. You're better at those things than I am. Just let me sit here." And Augustin Kovac sat on that cold stone bench and understood that he had nothing. He couldn't buy her. She had pushed his money back toward him with 2 fingers the week before. He couldn't frighten her. She had sat inside a room kept at roughly 36 degrees for 31 hours without saying a word. He couldn't command her, because she wasn't one of his people and never had been. All 14 years of his lawless life, his entire empire built on fear and leverage, had given him no tool that could be used here. So he sat beside her. The first train arrived, opened its doors, closed them, and left. He didn't say anything. The second train arrived, opened its doors, closed them, and left. A man stepped off, pulled up his collar, walked past them, and didn't look. The third train arrived. Its light swept across their faces. The doors opened, the doors closed. It left. Then Augustin Kovac spoke very quietly without turning toward her. "Are you hungry?" And Renata Vukovic, who hadn't cried when they dragged her into the van in broad daylight, who hadn't cried inside the holding room while her coat hung beyond the square window, who hadn't cried when she heard an entire city call her a hostage over the radio, began to weep. Because that was the question she had asked him, and in 27 years, no one had ever asked it of her in return. They ate half the loaf of bread on that stone bench, dividing it between them without speaking, while the sky changed from black to the shade of gray Chicago, used in place of dawn during February. Then Renata wiped her hands on the hem of his wool coat and said with sharp, focused intent, "Give me your hand." He looked at her. "Your right hand. Give it to me." He did. She took it, turned it palm up, and studied it for a moment as though she were reading a chart. "You can't use your left arm. Your forearm is broken halfway down. I heard the sound when you opened the door. You'll try to hide it, you'll hold it behind your back, and anyone about to hit you will discover it within 3 seconds. She lowered his hand onto her lap. "You'll lose if you keep fighting like a man. I'm not planning to fight anyone again. You're lying. You're terrible at it. And I've worked in emergency care for 8 years, so don't lie to me." She turned on the bench until she was facing him. "Sit up straight. Let your shoulders drop." He obeyed because she had used that voice, and because 3 weeks earlier that same voice had told him to take off his coat and sit down, and he had sat down. She raised her right hand, extended her thumb, and placed it in the small hollow above his right collarbone, the place no one ever thought about, the place people touched every day without knowing what they were touching. "Here," she said, "the brachial plexus. It lies just beneath the skin, behind the muscle. There's no bone protecting it. There's nothing protecting it at all." Then she pressed. Augustin Kovac's right arm, his uninjured arm, the arm that had done everything that needed to be done in the corridor of warehouse number 7 the night before, dropped uselessly beside him like a rope that had been cut. He looked at it, he tried to curl his fingers. Nothing happened. For 3.5 seconds, the man whose name 200 people in this city didn't dare speak aloud, sat on a stone bench with both arms useless, while a woman who weighed 112 pounds sat before him. With her thumb resting lightly above his collarbone, she released him, feeling returned slowly, like water flowing back into a pipe. "There," she said. "You don't need strength, you don't need size, you only need to know where. Where did you learn that?" "I didn't learn it, I see it every night. I see where people break, I see what makes them break. I see what makes them stop hurting and what makes them stop moving. After 8 years of looking at the same thing, you know." She picked up the last piece of bread and didn't eat it. She only held it. "You saved me your way. Now I'm giving you mine." Then she was silent for a long time, and when she spoke again, the professional voice was gone. "Do you know why I poured you coffee that night?" He didn't answer. "It wasn't because you were kind. You aren't kind. You sat in my nurse's station at 3 o'clock in the morning with something under your clothes and 4 men who wouldn't sit down." She looked at the piece of bread in her hand. "It was because you had that look on your face." "What look?" "The look of someone telling himself that no one would remember him anyway. That if he disappeared that night, it would only mean one less name on some list no one ever read." She drew in a breath. "My younger brother had that same look. He sat in my kitchen 3 days before he died. He sat in the chair beside the window and stared outside, and I walked past him twice. The 4th train entered the station. No one got off. I was tired that day. My shift started at 7 o'clock. I thought I could ask him tomorrow. I went to bed." She placed the piece of bread on the stone bench between them. "So I asked you. That was all. There wasn't any nobler reason, Mr. Kovac. I asked a stranger whether he had eaten because I hadn't asked my own brother." Augustin Kovac sat very still. 14 hours of searching, 1 broken forearm, 2 of his men left behind on the stone floor of a church that had been closed for years, an old man who would never walk again, a ruined car in the courtyard, an entire empire beginning to crack beneath his feet while he sat there. And all of it had begun because a grieving woman had asked the wrong man a question she should have asked someone else. "You did," he said softly. "You did ask him." Renata turned toward him. "Your brother. You asked me in his place." She said nothing. But she didn't deny it, and they remained there until daylight had fully arrived. By 9 o'clock in the morning, St. Adalbert Community Hospital was surrounded from 2 sides, and neither side knew what the other was doing. At the main entrance, beneath the concrete canopy, 2 patrol cars were parked at angles, while 4 uniformed officers stood drinking coffee from paper cups, searching for a kidnapper. In the employee parking lot, the same lot where a blue plastic lunch container had fallen into the snow at noon on Tuesday, 3 unmarked cars were scattered among the other vehicles, and the people sitting inside them weren't searching for any kidnapper at all. They were searching for a wooden chess king. Augustin studied the arrangement from across the street and began to calculate. He had been calculating things like this for 14 years. He knew how to enter a building, he knew how to leave one, and he knew who had to be paid, how much, and by whom. He opened his mouth to explain the plan, and Renata Vukovic cut him off. No, he turned toward her. You don't know this building. She pulled the hood of his wool coat up over her hair, and she spoke in that flat voice, the voice that had made 4 men who refused to sit down take their seats. You know other buildings. You don't know this one. I've worked here for 8 years. I know which doors squeak, which stairways are broken, and who stands where at what time. She looked at him. You follow me. In here, I'm the boss. And Augustin Kovac followed. The way inside could be described in a single sentence. The laundry basement on the lowest level, the trash elevator, no one had installed a camera in, because no one believed there was anything worth seeing there, and an emergency stairwell near pediatrics, whose sensor had been broken for years, and no one had repaired because there was no money in the budget. She led the way with one hand against the wall, moving slowly and steadily, pausing for exactly 1 beat at every corner to listen, while Augustine walked behind her with his left forearm pressed against his side, and throughout those 7 minutes, he didn't say a word and didn't need to. This was her building. She opened the staff break room door the way someone opened the door to her own home, and inside, third-year resident Marisol Quijano stood in front of the coffee machine, with both hands wrapped around a cup as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. And she had been crying, and she had been crying since noon on Tuesday. The cup fell. It didn't break, it only spilled, coffee spreading across the vinyl floor, and no one paid any attention. Marisol crossed the room, wrapped her arms around Renata, and couldn't speak for nearly 30 seconds. And during those 30 seconds, Renata stood still and allowed someone to hold her, and that was something she hadn't done with anyone in 4 months. Then Marisol stepped back, her hands still gripping her friend's shoulders, and saw the man standing in the doorway. She stared at him for a long time. The entire city had been looking at that face on television screens since 6 o'clock that morning. Rennie, her voice was very quiet. Do you know who he is? Yes, do you know what they're saying on the news? They're saying, I know what they're saying, and you're still. Renata turned and looked at Augustin, then faced her friend again. She said it with a quiet, unshakable certainty, free of drama, her words delivered with the simple clarity of a self-evident truth. He's the only person who came, Marisol Quijano stood there with both hands still resting on her friend's shoulders, and something in her face broke very softly. She was a third-year resident. She had worked hundreds of night shifts beside Renata. She was the only person left in the world who still called Renata by the name her mother had once used, and she understood immediately and completely that the sentence hadn't been about the man in the doorway. It had been about the past 4 months. It had been about everyone who hadn't come. It had been about her, too. I'm sorry, Marisol said. I called you. I called 3 times the week after the funeral. You didn't answer, so I thought you needed. I thought you needed quiet, so Stop! Marisol fell silent. Then she wiped her face with the cuff of her white coat, drew in a breath, and became what she had spent 7 years being trained to become. She walked to a cabinet, took out 2 sets of scrubs, and tossed one to Augustin. She pulled her access badge from the collar of her coat and pressed it into Renata's hand. She looked at the clock on the wall. Shift change is at 11 o'clock. The halls will be crowded. It's the only time of day when no one looks at anyone else's face. Then she looked at her friend's belly, and her expression changed completely. Rennie, after this, you're letting me examine you. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you. The palliative care ward was on the 4th floor in the east wing, where the corridor was always quieter than the rest of the building because no one hurried here anymore. Room 409 had a window overlooking the parking lot, a bed, and an old man named Rudy Bahtijarovic, 84 years old, with no children, no grandchildren, and no one who had visited him in 30 years. Renata pushed open the door. He was lying on his side with his eyes closed, and she thought he was asleep. Then he opened them. It took them a moment to find her. Chess girl, he said. His voice was little more than breath. It's me, Uncle Rudy. He looked at her for a long time, and she could see him trying to fit something together inside his mind, and at last he managed it, and he said the one thing no one else throughout the past 14 hours had been able to say to this woman. You're 3 nights late. Renata Vukovic had been dragged into a van in broad daylight and hadn't screamed. She had sat on a plastic chair inside a room kept at roughly 36 degrees, staring at her coat hanging beyond the square window, and hadn't said a word. She had heard an entire city speak her name over the radio and hadn't shed a single tear. She collapsed against the old man's bedside and wept like a child. "I'm sorry, it's all right." His hand, all bone and paper, found her hair. "I knew you would come." Augustine Kovac stood in the doorway, looking out into the corridor and not into the room. Rudy tilted his chin toward the space beneath the bed. Renata pulled out the cardboard box, lifted the lid, and the chess set was still there, the cheap wooden pieces lying in their usual disorder. She found the king. She twisted off its base, empty. 4 seconds. Those were the longest 4 seconds of her life. "Uncle Rudy, I didn't keep the paper, chess girl," he coughed, and the cough cost him far more than it was worth. "I learned it." He raised one finger and tapped his temple twice, very lightly. "I've played chess for 70 years. I remember 300 games. You think I can't remember 24 characters?" She sank onto the floor beside the bed with the hollow chess piece in her hand. "I burned it the same night you gave it to me, in the chamber pot. The night nurse thought I was secretly smoking." He laughed, and the laugh became a cough, and he waited for it to pass. "If they found the paper, you would die. If they found me—" He shrugged, a movement so slight it was almost invisible. "I only have 2 weeks left anyway. I come out ahead." Renata looked at him. "Why did you keep it?" And Rudy Bahtijarovich, 84 years old, a man the entire healthcare system had stopped counting so long ago that no one had even bothered to enter an emergency contact number in his records because there was no one to list, looked at her through clouded eyes and spoke the sentence that would follow her to the grave. "Because you asked me to," he breathed. "No one has asked me for anything in 30 years. A cart rolled past in the corridor. Inside room 409, no one spoke for a while. Then the old man drew in a breath, and his voice changed, and in that moment he was no longer a patient. "Write it down." "I'll read it slowly." He looked up at the ceiling. "I can only read it once. The medicine makes my mind drift. This morning I couldn't even remember my doctor's name." Renata pulled a pen from the pocket of her scrubs, but she had no paper, so she wrote on the back of her hand. He recited it, slowly, haltingly, one character at a time, stopping halfway through to search for the next one in the place where it was already beginning to drift away. She wrote. Her hand trembled. Her writing was poor, and she had to write across the creased skin over her knuckles. When he reached the final character, he exhaled and closed his eyes, and the 9 o'clock sunlight coming through the window fell across half his face, and he smiled. Renata entered the string into Marisol's phone, into the storage archive she had created during some night shift 4 months earlier, with the trembling hands of a woman who had just held a watch inside a plastic bag. The screen thought. Then a message appeared. Authentication code required. The code has been sent to the registered phone number. Renata stared at those words, and all the blood in her body seemed to drain away. She had created the account at 3 o'clock in the morning, her eyes swollen, her hands cold, and when that field asked for a phone number, she had entered the virtual cloud-based VoIP number Casey had set up for their family. That physical phone was sitting dead and locked inside an evidence bag in a police storage room. But Casey Ardeline was a safety engineer who calculated failures for a living. He had configured that virtual number to exist entirely on a cloud server. The moment the system sent the OTP to that number, the cloud server automatically routed and forwarded the incoming SMS directly to the secure, private email server they shared, bypassing the dead phone entirely. Marisol Quijano spread gel across her friend's belly inside the staff room. The door locked, the lights turned off, with only the blue glow of the handheld ultrasound machine the department used for quick bedside examinations. She moved the probe very slowly. Then she stopped. She stared at the screen longer than a friend should ever have to stare. "Rennie, I see it. The baby is lower than last time, I know. I can read that screen, Mari. I've worked here for 8 years, then you know what I'm about to say." Marisol wiped the probe with a paper towel, and her hands were perfectly steady, but her voice wasn't. "You have to lie down. Not tomorrow. Not after you finish what you're doing. Right now. You're going to lie down on that bed, and you aren't getting up again until I allow it." Renata stared at the ceiling, where a water stain was shaped like a fish. "If I lie down now, those 9 people die a second time," but she had nothing left to stand up for. The authentication code was inside a phone that had been powered off for 4 months, sealed in a labeled evidence bag inside the Hammond Police Department property room. And between her and that phone stood a warrant she didn't have, a lawyer she couldn't afford, and 6 weeks when she didn't have 6 weeks. She said exactly that aloud, and Augustine Kovac, standing with his back against the door and his left forearm pressed to his side, spoke in the quiet voice that made people lean closer to hear. "Or you need someone with friends in the property room," he called Benny. The call lasted less than half a minute. Gate D loading bay 4, 9:30. There was a long silence on the other end. "Augie. Do you understand what that means?" "I do. 30 years. Your godfather started at that loading bay, 9:30. Uncle Benny, at 9:20, Renata logged into their private encrypted backup email. There, sitting in the inbox, was the forwarded SMS notification. A string of numbers blinked on the screen, the final code Casey Ardeline ever sent his wife, 4 months after he was laid to rest. She entered it. The archive opened, and Renata Vukovic, night shift emergency room nurse at St. Adalbert Community Hospital, an employee with lawful access to the records of 9 patients who had died at clinics sponsored by that hospital, the only person in the world who could do this without anyone being able to dismiss it, pressed send to the federal whistleblower portal. 10 minutes later, at 9:30, the day shift at the Northline warehouse didn't report for work. No one damaged anything. No one shouted slogans. 41 dock workers sat down on the sidewalk outside Gate D in a single line, silent, lawful, and precisely within the boundary of public property. By 9:50, there were 3 television vans, 1 helicopter, and 2 Hammond police cruisers parked across the gate. By 10:15, the town's entire morning shift was standing there, because when a helicopter appeared, people had to show up. That was the rule. The 41 people who sat on that sidewalk that morning were never hired again. They sat there to ensure that now that the truth was sent, the world would already be watching. Then she set the phone down. Then she lay back. Marisol pulled the blanket over her without saying anything and began preparing an IV line. At the elevator, Augustin stood waiting for the doors to open, and Renata called after him from the stretcher. "Mr. Kovac," he turned. "You owe me a cup of coffee. I already repaid you." "No," she looked at him. "You never finished drinking it." The elevator doors closed. He didn't chase her. He was already sitting inside the refrigerated trailer of the last Northline tractor trailer to leave loading bay 4 that morning, between rows of pallets, on an overturned plastic crate, and he waited. Felicity Arnaud climbed inside wearing her white blazer, carrying no gun and bringing no one with her, and when the trailer door closed behind her, she didn't even look surprised. "Mr. Kovac," she brushed a speck of dust from her sleeve. "Do you know what you've just done? You didn't save her. You turned her into a federal witness." The truck began moving. The floor vibrated beneath them. "Do you know the life expectancy of a witness who testifies against a company like mine? We don't kill anyone. We don't need to. An insurance claim is denied because one signature is missing. A file disappears between 2 departments. One phone call is made to the Human Resources office of every place where she applies for work. We only have to outlive them, Mr. Kovac. We always outlive them." Then she stepped forward and struck his left forearm. Not with her fist. With the pen in her hand, precisely at the midpoint of the bone, and she knew where to strike because she had read the report, because she read every report, because that was the whole of her profession. He folded forward. She didn't strike again. She simply shoved him onto the floor of the refrigerated trailer, sat on his chest, and pressed her forearm across his throat with the calm of someone signing a document on a Tuesday afternoon. "This isn't your territory," she said, and Augustin Kovac raised his right hand, not toward her face, not toward her throat, but placed his thumb in the small hollow above Felicity Arnaud's right collarbone, the place no one ever thought about, the place no bone protected, and he pressed. Her right arm dropped beside her like a rope that had been cut. The pen rolled away. On the 3rd floor of St. Adalbert Community Hospital, inside operating room 2, resident physician Marisol Ciano glanced up at the monitor on her left to read the numbers, and there, in the upper right corner, a compliance warning window was flashing. Patient record query outside authorized scope. 9 patients, matching dates. The name attached to the query was hers. She looked at it for exactly 1 beat, then she lowered her eyes and continued suturing. "Another unit of blood," she told the circulating nurse. The monitor continued its steady beeping. Her hands didn't tremble, didn't slow, and didn't stray by even a fraction of an inch, because 7 years of training had been meant for precisely this moment. Then she spoke very quietly to no one at all. I mustn't leave this table. Not now, she drew in a breath. If I leave, I'll fall apart. The tractor trailer pulled onto the emergency shoulder. The rear door flew open, and February wind and daylight rushed inside, and Felicity Arnault, one arm useless, slid toward the edge and caught hold of the lapel of his scrub top with her remaining hand. Pull me up! Her face had gone white. Pull me up! Augustin Kovac pulled her back. He dragged her inside, lowered her onto the floor of the refrigerated trailer, and crouched in front of her. You're going to live, he said. You're going to sit inside a courtroom and listen while they read those 9 names aloud, one at a time, slowly, and you'll have to remain there and hear every one of them. He stood. Death is an escape. I'm not giving you an escape. Outside, 30 yards away, standing beside the car that had brought her there, was Tobias Lenhart. He didn't run. He dropped to his knees in the dirty snow beside the interstate and began to cry. How much? Augustin asked. It wasn't money, Augie. How much, Toby? It was Nell. He didn't look up. My sister. She's 22 years old. She's number 340 on the kidney transplant waiting list. Mrs. Arnault said she could move her up to number 4. The wind moved around them. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have said no. Only then did Toby look up, and his was the face of a man who had calculated the same decision thousands of times over 6 months. You have principles, Augie. You've always had principles, and my sister is dying because of those principles. Augustin stood there for a long time. Then he took out his phone, dialed a number with his right hand, and waited. Dr. Kijano. There's a young woman named Nell Lenhart. Tell me what you need to get her into St. Adalbert's donor program. He listened. He nodded. All right, I'll take care of it. He ended the call and looked down at his driver. Stand up. Go wash your face. You aren't. You drove for me for 6 years. And you were still too afraid to ask me one question. He turned away. That's my fault, Toby. I built something people were afraid to ask for help. The scrapyard was in Cicero, behind a chain-link fence and a dog that no longer bothered to bark, and the wreckage of the Mercedes had been hauled there from the church courtyard 2 days earlier. It rested at an angle among the other cars, every window shattered, every tire flat, and beneath the February light it no longer looked like something expensive. It only looked like something broken. August Kovac climbed across the twisted metal with one hand and opened the passenger door. The door gave a long groan, and he reached into the glove compartment. The blue plastic lunch container was still there. One corner had been crushed. A crack ran across the lid from the day it had fallen into the melting snow in the employee parking lot on that Tuesday afternoon. He lifted it with his right hand, brushed away the fragments of glass, and stood there for a long time in the middle of the scrapyard with the container in his hand, a 34-year-old man wearing hospital scrubs with one forearm he couldn't use. Then he climbed back out, walked to the cheap rental car parked outside the gate, sat behind the wheel, placed the container on the dashboard, and took a folded sheet of paper and a pen from his pocket. He wrote 9 names. He wrote slowly with his right hand, and his handwriting still carried the square, careful lines of a boy who had learned to write in a public school on the South Side. The 81-year-old man in Cicero, the old woman who sold flowers at Maxwell Market, the house painter, the dishwasher. He wrote all 9, and his hand didn't stop. It kept writing. He hadn't intended to write anything more. He watched his fingers move as though they belonged to someone else. Merrick Billick, both hands broken. He remembered that night, remembered the warehouse, remembered the $4,000 that now sounded so small it was almost absurd, and he remembered that he had been the one who nodded, and he couldn't remember what he had been thinking when he did. Yusuf Adeyemi. Lost his store. Augustin hadn't burned that store. He had only spoken to the landlord, and he had spoken very quietly, and afterward the lease hadn't been renewed, and Yusuf had moved somewhere else, and Augustin had never asked where. Tomas Zaleski. He couldn't remember what had happened to Tomas Zaleski after that summer. He had never asked. He kept writing. Darkness began to gather beyond the windshield, and he switched on the overhead light and continued. The woman who owned the laundromat on Cermak Street. The man at Loading Bay 5 whose nickname was the only thing he could remember. The paperboy he had dismissed with a single sentence and never thought about again. He had written 17 names when his hand stopped. It didn't stop because there were no more names. It stopped because there were no more names he could remember. Augustine Kovac sat inside the rental car at the Cicero scrapyard, with the paper resting on his lap and the misshapen plastic lunch container on the dashboard. And he read those 17 names 3 times, and he tried to remember more, and he couldn't. 14 years. 200 men under his command. How many nods inside, how many rooms with closed windows, and all that remained inside his mind were 17 names and a blank space behind them. A blank space he couldn't measure, couldn't look into, and would never be able to fill again. He thought about the man sitting on the 44th floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. The man who had signed a document about maintenance cost margins on some Tuesday and no longer remembered signing it. Augustine Kovac had spent his entire life telling himself that he was different. He didn't sell drugs within 4 blocks of a school. He didn't touch women. He didn't touch children. He had principles, and for 14 years he had told himself that story every day, and he had believed it, and now, sitting inside a rental car among piles of twisted metal, he looked directly at that story and saw what it truly was. Hollis Weatherby III hadn't counted 9 people. Augustine Kovac hadn't counted 17. There was no difference between them in what they were. They differed only in the number of people and in which floor each man occupied. The only difference between them, the only difference left in the world, was that tonight one of them was holding a pen. He folded the paper into quarters and slipped it into his breast pocket. Then he picked up the plastic lunch container, placed it on the seat beside him, fastened the seatbelt around it with one hand, and started the engine. No one stopped him in the lobby. The black stone reception desk, more than 30 feet long, stood empty. The card scanner at the security gate continued blinking green, and no one stood beside it. Inside the elevator rising to the 44th floor, Augustine Kovac rode with 2 women wearing coats and carrying cardboard boxes filled with their personal belongings, and neither woman glanced at him because they were too busy staring at their phones, where a red graph was plunging at an angle no one in that building had ever seen before. Empires didn't collapse with an explosion. They collapsed to the sound of people quietly putting on their coats and going home. Hollis Weatherby III sat behind his walnut desk near 8 o'clock that evening with a glass of whiskey and 3 screens, and he didn't startle when the door opened. He merely looked up at the man in hospital scrubs, one forearm hanging uselessly in dirty snow clinging to the cuffs of his pants, and gave a weary laugh. Do you know how much this desk cost? More than a night shift nurse, more than 9 people at free clinics. He took a drink. There, I said it plainly. That's what you wanted to hear, isn't it? Augustine said nothing. You think I killed them? Weatherby set down his glass. I never met a single one of them. I didn't know their faces. I didn't know their names until this morning, when 41 men sat down on a sidewalk and held them up in front of television cameras. He turned his chair toward the glass wall, toward the black lake below. I signed one document. It was about cold chain maintenance cost margins. 3 minutes of my life on some Tuesday, between a personnel meeting and a call with Denver. He turned back. I don't even remember signing it. Then he leaned back and named the amount. $40 million, cash, overseas, within 6 hours. The nurse would receive proper compensation sincerely, and he would pay generously. The child would have a college fund. No one else would die. You've won, Mr. Kovac. Take your victory and go home. Augustine Kovac walked to the desk and placed 2 things on its walnut surface. A blue plastic lunch container with 1 crushed corner and a crack running across the lid, and a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Weatherby looked down. What is this? Open it. He did. He read the 17 names handwritten in the square, careful script of a boy who had attended public school on the South Side, and he didn't understand, and that confusion showed clearly on his face. I don't know these names. No, Augustine said. They're mine. Weatherby looked up. You can't buy this, Mr. Weatherby. Not because it's sacred. There's nothing sacred about it. It's only a piece of paper. He tapped it once with 1 finger. You can't buy it because you've never picked it up long enough to know how much it weighs. You've signed papers for 40 years, and you've never truly held a single one. Hollis Weatherby III yanked open the drawer on his right and pulled out a small handgun he had bought years earlier and had never touched, and he pulled the trigger for the first time in his life. The bullet passed over Augustine's shoulder and struck the glass behind him. The glass shattered. Wind from Lake Michigan rushed into the 44th floor, scattering papers throughout the office and knocking over the glass of whiskey. and Augustine Kovac walked around the desk, took Weatherby's wrist in his right hand, gently, exactly the way a doctor checked a pulse, and removed the gun from his hand as though taking a toy from a child. He unloaded it. He placed the gun on the desk. Then he pulled out the chair opposite Weatherby and sat down. Weatherby was breathing rapidly. "What are you doing?" "Sitting. You're sitting for what? 9 minutes." Augustine looked at him across the desk. 9 minutes is the average length of an appointment at a free clinic. I looked it up. People line up from 6 o'clock in the morning for 9 minutes. Wind whistled through the broken window. 9 minutes for a doctor to look someone in the eyes and tell them the medicine is good, that they don't need to worry. The doctor believes what he's saying. The temperature log is sitting right there on his desk, stamped, signed, perfect. Augustine placed both hands on his lap. "I want you to understand how long 9 minutes feels," and then there was nothing else. No one spoke. No one stood. Wind moved through the hole in the glass as papers slid across the floor, and somewhere far below, a car horn sounded, and 2 men sat across from one another, at a walnut desk, for 9 minutes. No one stormed the 44th floor. The following morning, Augustine Kovac walked alone to the federal building in the Loop, carrying a cardboard box in his right arm, and he waited in line to pass through the scanner like everyone else. He placed the box on Special Agent Priya Raghunathan's desk, sat in the chair across from her, and waited for the question he had spent the entire night preparing to answer. She didn't ask it. She looked at the box for a long time, then opened the drawer on the left side of her desk, gestured toward it with her chin, and closed it again. "I've had enough to prosecute you since last spring, Mr. Kovac. It's sitting inside that drawer. Why didn't you use it?" "Because a jury needs a narrative. And my case was missing a piece." She placed both hands on the desk. "The part that explains why. I spent 6 years sitting here, waiting for you to do something stupid for money. Just once. You never did." She looked at the cardboard box. "Then you did something stupid that had nothing to do with money. Now I have that chapter, and it isn't the one I wanted. It took me 6 years to believe the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, and this morning you brought that box into my office and shattered it. I preferred the old world. It was easier to work in. Write in your report that I calculated everything. Write that I was buying time. Write whatever you need. I won't write that." She pulled the box toward herself, "because it would be a lie. And I spent 6 years trying not to become someone like you." She looked at the clock on the wall. "You still have time to run. 40 minutes if you leave right now." "I promised someone that she would be the one to tell her child," Augustine said. "A promise only has value if the person who made it is still standing there when the price comes due." He held out both hands. Weeks later, after enduring strict days of bed rest and fetal preservation under Marisol's constant vigil, there was finally a cry on the 3rd floor of St. Adalbert Community Hospital. Very angry and strong, and there was light. In the corridor an hour later, Marisol Quijano stood against the wall, with the scent of antiseptic soap still clinging to her hands. "Rennie, I was the one who gave them your name. The night you asked me to retrieve the records of those 9 people. I pulled them, and I also reported it to compliance because that was procedure. I didn't know. I thought it was only paperwork, I know." Marisol went still. "I saw the query log that day in the staff room. You knew, and you still let me operate on you?" Renata looked at her friend for a long time. "Mari, you're the best doctor in this building. I didn't have a better choice." And Marisol Quijano, who hadn't cried during a single shift in 7 years, sank down onto the corridor floor. The trial lasted nearly a year. Northline Logistics was dissolved. Compensation reached the family slowly and in smaller amounts than they deserved, but it came, and part of it reached a small house in Cicero, where an old woman named Dorothy opened the door and didn't understand why. The witness who spoke most forcefully in Augustine Kovac's defense was Tobias Lenhart, and in the back row, a healthy 23-year-old woman named Nell sat crying. Augustine pleaded guilty. No bargaining, no brilliant lawyer, no cooperation agreement. 17 years for 17 names, and the person who read those 17 names aloud into the record wasn't the prosecutor, but the woman who had hunted him for 6 years, because that was the only thing he asked for. 2 winters later, in the prison visiting yard in February, snow fell in the large, slow flakes children loved. A 14-month-old boy toddled between 2 adults, fell down, stood up again, and laughed with delight. Renata placed a paper cup of coffee from the vending machine in the lobby on the table, the worst coffee for miles around. Have you eaten anything? No. She took half a sandwich from her bag and broke it in two. Little Tomas reached across the table and touched his fingers. The greatest evil in this story had never hated anyone. It had simply failed to count them. And the only way to fight it, the only thing any one of us can do on any given evening is to count. Count every person, one by one, even the poor, even those who are about to be lost, even those the whole world forgot long ago. The ghost didn't disappear into the wind. This time, the ghost stayed and paid the price, and that was the hardest thing of all. When visiting hours ended, all that remained in the snow of the prison yard were 2 rows of adult footprints and one tiny, unsteady trail walking between them. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you haven't checked on in a long time, and subscribe to our channel to hear new stories every day. How do you feel about Augustine's choice and about everything Renata chose to protect? Please share your thoughts in the comments. We truly want to hear what is in the deepest part of your heart. We wish you abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.